que bueno, vamos a empezar. Buenos días, buenas tardes, donde sea que se
Let's
encuentran.
begin. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to
Mi nombre es
greet you and
Florencia
welcome to
Filibrici,
this space. I'm Lorencia
subdirectora de Earth
Filibrici.
Insight,
I'm the
y es un
Deputy
gran placer
Director of
darles la
Earth
bienvenida.
Inside, and it's a pleasure to
Este
welcome you.
webinario ha sido organizado por Earth
This
Insight
webinar
en
has been
conjunto con
organized
INTA,
by Earth
con
Insight
IDESEP,
together with Tinta,
con COIABI,
IDESEB,
Orpio y
Koyabi,
Alianza Global de
Orpio,
Comunidades
the
Territoriales y
Global
Sustentables,
Alliance of
que se
Territorial
centra
Communities,
en las
and COICA.
soluciones
It
territoriales
focuses
lideradas por
on
países indígenas
indigenous-led
frente a las
solutions
amenazas territoriales,
to territorial threats.
particularmente en la urgencia de proteger
Particularly
unos
focuses
territorios
on the
críticos
urgency of
y los
protecting one
pueblos
of the most
indígenas
critical
en
sites
aislamiento.
of
La biodiversidad
indigenous
es
peoples
y
in
estamos hablando
isolation.
del corredor Yavarita-Piche.
In terms of biodiversity and climate, we are talking about the
Este diálogo tiene
Javari
lugar en un
Tapiche
momento
corridor.
clave tras la
This dialogue
constitución
takes
del
place in
Foro
a key
Permanente para las Cuestiones
moment
Indígenas en
after the
Argentina
recent
2002,
session of the
2014.
Permanent
Se
Forum
reafirmó algo
of
fundamental,
Indigenous Matters
que la
at the
salud,
UN here in New
el
York,
bienestar,
where something
la
fundamental was
seguridad y el
reaffirmed
futuro
in that
de los
health,
pueblos
welfare,
indígenas
the
y el futuro de todos
future
nosotros,
of indigenous
también
peoples and the future of all of
ligado
us
a que los pueblos indígenas tengan la protección de su territorio,
is
de sus
linked
destinos y sus derechos
to the
y de sus
protection
sistemas de conocimiento.
of indigenous
También se
peoples
destacó la
as well as the
urgente
protection of their
necesidad de
rights
protección
and
de los
knowledge
pueblos
systems.
indígenas
It
y
was
los
also
líderes
highlighted
de
that there
las
is a
lideresas de
increasing
las
emergency
mujeres y
to
los pueblos en
protect
aislamiento y contacto inicial,
indigenous
cuyas
leaders,
amenazas sí son cada vez
women,
mayores
and
en
those
base al
peoples
extractivismo
in
y a los
isolation
conflictos
and
y
initial
a la crisis
contact
climática.
who are facing
Para
greater
abordar
threats
esta
based
importante temática,
or
este
because of
evento lo hemos
extractivism, conflicts, and
estructurado
climate crisis.
a partir de
This event has been
dos
structured
partes, un panel
into
introductorio que vamos a
parts.
avanzar en la
We will
presentación,
have first
que escucharemos de
a
líderes
panel
que han estado
where we
avanzando
will
en la
listen
protección
to leaders who
en
have made
el corredor
progress
Yavarita-Piche,
on the
liderado
protection
por
of the
líderes de
Javarita
Orpio, de
Picha corridor.
COIABI y de
We will
AIDESEP,
listen to
que también
leaders from
estaremos
Orpio,
nombrando.
Koyabi, and
Y
IDASEP.
también
I will
escucharemos en
introduce
un
them to
segundo
you
panel
later.
líderes de la
Then we will
COICA,
have
de
a
la
second
Alianza Global,
panel. We will
que
listen to
abordarán
leaders from
amenazas a nivel
Global
macro y
Alliance
global.
and COICA, and
Veremos que estas
they
amenazas
will talk about
no
regional
son
and global threats.
aisladas y
We
que
will
se
see that
encuentran en
these are
diferentes
not
contextos.
isolated threats and that they are found in
Em,
different contexts.
Antes de empezar a invitar a los panelistas a
Before we
que
begin to
nos
invite the panelists
compartan sus mensajes,
so that they can
me
share
gustaría
their
compartirles que en esta
contributions,
instancia vamos a lanzar un informe Huellas
I want to tell
Desaparecidas
you that we
de
will be
carácter
releasing
de
a
defensa de
report
los pueblos
called
indígenas aislados
Vanishing
en las zonas de
Footprints, the
transición
race to
en
protect
el
the
Amazonas.
isolated
Y
indigenous
hacemos
peoples of
la
the Javari
presentación
Tapiche corridor in the
en
Amazon.
vivo. Y me va a gustar también poder compartirles algunos de los hallazgos principales
And
de
I
este
would like to also
informe
share with you some
para
of the main
dar
findings
la
of this
oportunidad. Por favor,
recent
disfrutemos
report, the
aquí
report that
podemos
we are
ver el
releasing
informe que vamos a
today.
escuchar y este es el informe que estamos lanzando
So
hoy.
this is the report we are releasing
Que,
today,
que me gustaría pasarle a la próxima presentación para contarles un poco de los
and
hallazgos
I
que
would like
encontramos. Bueno, este
to
informe
talk
lo
about
hemos
some of the
elaborado en
findings.
conjunto junto con Orpio,
This
COIABI
report
y AIDESEP
was
y forma
co-authored with
parte
Earth
de un
Insight
proyecto
together with Orpio
amplio de
Koyabe and
colaboración
IDASEB.
con
It is a
muchas organizaciones
it's
aliadas
part of a
y
broader
emancipadas
effort of
que
many ally
lideran sus enfocadas
organizations
amenazas como
to
aspectos de
raise
soluciones que
visibility
vienen del
of
territorio
threats,
por
but
parte de los
also of
pueblos indígenas.
solutions that
En este
come
mapeo
from indigenous
podemos
leaders
ver
of the
las amenazas,
territories.
pero antes
In
de
this map, we
compartirles
see the
esta
threats.
situación tan concreta y
But
tan
before I share with you
problemática, quiero
this
recordarles a todos que el corredor Yavarita-Piche
difficult
es uno de los bosques
situation, I
intactos
want to remind you
más grandes
that
de
the
la Amazonía, que
Javari
alberga la
Tapache
mayor
corridor is one of the
concentración
most
mundial de pueblos
intact
indígenas
forests,
en
one of the
aislamiento
largest
y
intact forests in
contacto
the
inicial,
Amazon that encompasses a great
con más
concentration
de
of
16
indigenous
millones
peoples in
de
isolation and
hectáreas.
initial contact. It has more than
Esto es el
16 million
doble de
hectares.
Panamá
This
en
is
un
double
territorio
Panama.
de altísima
This is
biodiversidad y
twice
de alto
Panama.
impacto
It is a
climático.
territory
Sin
of high
embargo,
biodiversity and
las
climate
crecientes
relevance.
presiones por petróleo, gas,
But recent
tala
pressures
y
due
minería
to oil, gas,
ponen una situación
logging,
muy
and
crítica al
mining
territorio y
put
abren
this
también
territory
camino
at
a las
risk.
actividades ilegales que
and it leads to other illegal activities that are threatening the territory and the people who live in it. For indigenous organizations, establishing this corridor is not only a territorial proposal, but also a strategy of survival and protection. Without it, violence, diseases, essential ecosystem, many other matters are at risk. At the right, we see the references where the border is in the territory. We see indigenous peoples in blue, the Piazza Reserve in light blue. We see the the requested Piazza Reserve in brown, and the corridors at risk due to oil and gas in red. 10% of the Yaravita Piche corridor overlaps with oil and gas blocks. And these are not hypothetical projects. Some of these projects are in production, others are being promoted. Next slide. Here we see infrastructure threats at the corridor. This is a significant threat. We see in red the proposed roads that add to the risk of the corridor. There are two specific roads that would be crossing the corridor and are 190 kilometers long. We know that in the Amazon and in intact territories, roads tend to promote deforestation, illegal economies, and territorial fragmentation. On top of this, opening up the territory ends up creating secondary roads that you see on the right of the map. They penetrate the forest and produce very negative effects. Now, these effects have been intensified since 2015. Now, on this side, we see mining and logging threats. The map shows that there are 13 mining concessions inside the corridor. And on the Peruvian side, around 500,000 hectares have been affected by logging concessions, including the Piazzi reserves. This would be critical and high biodiversity areas. Now, besides mining and logging, these activities always lead to illegal activities, as we can see in the map, including illegal hunting, illegal logging, and other threats, and also puts at risk and forced contact the Piazzi, people in isolation. So this is everything what I showed you is at risk, is in stake. Now on this map we see carbon density in the corridor, and it has a really high carbon density. You see the corridor stores around 1.9 gigatons of carbon of above ground biomass, which accounts for 2.9 stored above the ground carbon in the entire Amazon. That's why it is so important to maintain these territories intact. Their carbon reserves are key for biodiversity and climate resilience. Now let's move on to the next map. So I want to focus on opportunities and what is at stake. So protected areas account for 75% of the corridor and 88% of the Piazza reserves in the corridor. As I said, these are enormous carbon reserves of biodiversity. They're critical for climate stability and also very important for the survival of peoples in isolation, and this ties in with respect or upholding indigenous rights. It is important to support and strengthen indigenous peoples that defend and live inside this territory. We need to look for ways to empower them so they can continue exercising this role of guardians of the forest and global biodiversity. So this is the introduction of some of the findings of the report. And so we now would like to listen to our three panelists. It is a pleasure, it is an honor to have them here, and they can really give us more context on these data, how these data link to their livelihoods, to their experiences in defending their territories. So now we will move on to listen to our first panelist. This is Leo Chunteca. He's a Matset leader and Orpio member. Leo, we want to thank you for your leadership. Your territory is located in the border territory between Peru and Brazil. He's a renowned leader in upholding indigenous rights, territorial protection, and Amazon forest protection. It is an honor to have you here. You have the floor.
Hello, you can hear me, right? Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Good, thank you. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Leo Chumac, leader of my community. And returning from the community with a lot of necessity and great commitments to defending the land and representing several leaders of the Yabarita Peach territory, we as an indigenous territory have been working on for many years. Since the year 2001, we have been working to defend our territories, and we have been defending logging, drug trafficking, large-scale fishing. We've been defending our territories against those activities. Personally, I have been working against this very serious situation in our territory, and these issues are often worsened by the very government. Often the state doesn't even believe in the existence of indigenous communities and indigenous and isolated peoples, what we call non-contacted peoples. So we have been working with a series of organizations who are truly concerned about our defense and their defense, because they are like us, the isolated peoples. They also have the right to their territories for their survival. We continue today to work to defend these communities, and I'm going to share a brief presentation with you. Yeah, please do go ahead. There it is. Thank you. So we have had strong participation on the part of community members that makes up our organization from many different sectors. from Yaquarana, Quetzalcoatl, the Rio Galvez region, and I represent the 19 chapters. In our small territory, we are at the heart of the territorial corridor of Yabarita. And for us, first and foremost, this is a great example to have different Amazonian indigenous peoples and to see how our indigenous brothers and sisters are sharing. And we have been living in this space for many decades, for many centuries. So it doesn't make sense for our brothers and sisters not to have a right over this land. So thanks to these organizations who have supported us in land titling processes for that territory, sometimes the state doesn't believe in the strength of the unity of Indigenous brothers and sisters in our organizations, while our brothers and sisters who live in isolation also have the right to their territory. So we indirectly protect them to make sure they can maintain these territories. Both our mixed brothers and sisters, as well as our Amazon region brothers and sisters, don't believe in this, unfortunately. That's why part of our advocacy has led to some issues. Not so much issues as questions about the needs that we have. And it's not only about isolated communities. Even ourselves as settled, civilized Indigenous peoples in this territorial corridor, we also require the presence of the state. For example, the health system is the biggest issue for us in the Amazon region, and personally, I have witnessed and faced this issue. Here on the map, you can see how difficult access is because of the distances. That's why the issue of health is the main priority in terms of public institutions and the government should be working on. And we should project ourselves towards that issue so that we can defend our health rights independently in order to help our isolated brothers and sisters which share a border with our territory. A long time ago, for a long time, this has been important for our community because we don't have a problem with right now, but in the future, we will face many different issues. That's why I feel that it's important to strengthen current organizations and leaders, the leaders of the 19 different regions or annexes or chapters. Because we are the owners of the land, the owners of the territorial corridor. Because we live to advocate for this territory today. Our commitment is to manage this defense throughout different sectors such as education, health, our brothers and sisters often feel abandoned by us when it comes to economic activity. It's important for our brothers and sisters and different indigenous organizations not to feel abandoned. That's why, and because that allows for a series of illegal activities such as coca plantations, illegal mining activities, logging or commercializing with wood, large-scale fishing. All of these activities offer economic solutions to these peoples, and often our peoples fall into this trap. And we cannot just stand by. Internally, the indigenous organizations don't receive support, unfortunately. So as indigenous organizations who are concerned about our territories, we must focus on this issue. So that is our main challenge as organized communities, as organized indigenous communities. And so I believe that as a leader, it's hugely important to protect this territorial corridor, all our territories, which are so vast. Unfortunately, the state has not been able to provide this protection. However, we do thank the state for the MATSES national protected areas. There are two, and there's also an indigenous Nevada Tapiche reserve. So for us, this is essential because it enables us to protect the survival of isolated peoples, because they also have the right to life, to hold on to their own territories, because the threat would be that for them and for us to be left without defense. And if that were to happen, we would get involved in different activities that could negatively affect our territories. They also have the right to self-determination in terms of protection, and they need to have guarantees over their lives and lands. It is also very relevant to mention the territorial corridor, because recently the organizations have been discussing the subject of climate change, because we have vast biodiversity, water reserves, fauna, flora, and at the global level, I believe it's hugely important to protect the environment. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leo, for your great leadership. And as you said, we're talking about the front line, and it's so important for support to reach you and all the other communities who are carrying out such important work to protect not only Opiac, but the world, as you said. Thank you very much. We'll move on with a few questions. But first, I would like to invite the next panelist to take the floor, Wanem Kanamari. Wanem, I would like to also thank you for your essential leadership. Wanem is a technician of Coyabi and a defender of the Brazilian Amazon region. She focuses on land protection Indigenous rights and ways of life, and she is a key voice in the defense of isolated peoples. Thank you, Wanen, for your leadership, your support, and for being with us today. You have the floor.
Oi, vocês estão me ouvindo?
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Primeiramente, boa tarde.
So first of all,
Me chamo Wanem, do povo Canamari,
good
do Alto
afternoon.
Médio Juruá. E aqui eu vou fazer uma apresentação sobre umas experiências, né, de outros, aonde que eu consegui, né, atuar de outros territórios, no Xingu, e atualmente estou, né, no Amazonas, vou fazer o ano na Coiabe, eu compor a equipe, né, da gerência de povos isolados e de recente contato na Coiabe. E eu quero dizer que a minha apresentação vai ser em breve, né, bem objetivas, sobre como que está sendo a visão da Coiabe atualmente, né? Então, vem uma preocupação sobre, né, como está sendo os desafios dentro dos territórios, né? A gente sabe que a Coiabe, ela trabalha com novos estados, né?
Coiabe is working with new states.
Atualmente,
It's very large.
Foi 55 dias. Foi uma experiência incrível, né?
It was an incredible experience together with Indigenous peoples from the Javari Valley, where there is the largest concentration of isolated Indigenous peoples. The pressure of illegal mining is exercises huge pressure on the borders of these territories. So Coiabe established this pattern that we need there's presence in these places. Our vision when I joined Coiabe in 2025 was, my view was the situation of other states like Pará, Mato Grosso, where I see that there is huge issues with illegal mining, drug trafficking, criminal activities in Indigenous territories. And Vale do Javari has this strength, this union. Indigenous peoples have a vigilance team which are working really strongly to oversee the territory, and it's an example for other territories of how unity makes it much harder for invaders to enter the territory, because they are already there putting pressure on the borders. But if there is less unity, there is less pressure from the invaders. So that unity is so important. And from February to April, that's what Coiabe has been working to encourage, to increase this unity amongst Indigenous peoples. And we really respect this will to strengthen the basis of the organizations, the work that has been going on. So to offer that support, that attention, particularly Vale do Javari, where there is the largest concentration of isolated peoples and so many issues among the Indigenous peoples. So we participated in a training that was the first training of trainers for environmental monitoring. These are the images that we have. We received an invitation from Coiabe to accompany this training because professionals were needed to train, to provide the training, to teach the training. You know, for these teams of supervision teams or vigilance teams, So the state, the government must value this work, which is so dangerous. We know how dangerous it is. We really need to support these teams who are on the ground carrying out monitoring, supervision. So I accompanied this process very closely. And today, Koyabi is becoming a strategic support. So we need to support a large project. The cost is very hard. Vale do Javari is larger than countries such as Portugal, for example, in size. So it's hard to have the scope of the entire territory. In Juruá, there's activities going on as well. So that's the concern of our team. How can we avoid or make this invasion retreat from the borders of the Javari region, which is already happening? So for me, it's still a challenge, and we still need to seek support more and more and understand if Koyabi and our grassroots organizations can do this, can offer the support, because we work off projects. And so to strengthen that work, that activity that is being carried out over the last 3 years after Indigenous activist Bruno's death. And so this is the work that we have been accompanying, fantastic exchange of experiences, always focused on knowledge, the knowledge of the different peoples, their history. Many of the people are very young. And all of this material prioritizes our natural resources, how we can use these as tools to set up a campsite. So everything was focused on expanding their knowledge. We had it was a several days long training. So there was a great exchange of ideas, and the idea was for Koyabi to work more with trainings and bring professionals to work in these trainings. And this work is already being carried out by them, but Koyabi is also present there. And what I said often at Koyabi is that for some time we were distant, and for a reason. We need to understand the grassroots in order to respect and understand the key points where Koyabi should be working. So it was an incredible experience, and we're here to continue strengthening the grassroots, the different organizations from the Amazon region, and make sure they also strengthen their bases. Univaja, Evu. So it's super important to carry out this kind of activity and to expand this outside of these territories as well, and make sure the government, the state, is involved and we have their support. That's why Koyabi is working to create public policies to directly with isolated peoples and peoples who have been recently contacted. And we have a big challenge in our sector because of land titling, land demarcations, very complex issues. I've spoken about this with Toya, our coordinator, and explained that we need to create a sector just to work on land demarcation, because there's a lot of work in that sector. It used to be more reduced, but it's growing. So we need more focus there, and particularly for the most distant lands, for the borders close to Juruá, Vale do Javari, which right now I'm in Juruá, and I'm witnessing the great challenge that exists. Because where deforestation exists, it doesn't mean that we don't need to pay attention to those areas. That's exactly where we need to focus on, because we need to prevent more deforestation, because when deforestation happens, it becomes more difficult to throw the invaders out of those territories. And that is a big challenge that I see, because I already worked in a different territory where several situations took place, and we can no longer go there because the indigenous peoples are so involved in criminal activities that it becomes a concern for us. So that those are the critical challenges for us.
So this requires to continue working against this, because I mean it is a threat to our own brothers and sisters. These are many difficulties with invaders, with illegal miners, with illegal fishery, and this requires unity so that we can strengthen ourselves together. We're looking for support. We know that Koyabi is already supporting 9 states, um, and so Vale do Javari, it's one of those points that requires attention. We need to strengthen Koyabi. We need to strengthen their grassroots, the different organizations. This was my brief presentation. I was able to show you some pictures that you could understand the training that took place at Vale do Javari. This took place in on February 23rd. And on March 23rd, we also had a training of Indigenous instructors on territorial and environmental surveillance. The aim is for them to be able to protect this market, and it's important to continue training our indigenous peoples. A lot of progress has been made on this regard. And you know what? This is what we need. And we also need to take this experience to the outside. And this is only possible through unity. This is the only way that we're going to be able to face these invaders that come into our territories. You know, they come in and they just start cutting down our trees. And this is a bottleneck for our brothers and sisters. You know that without trees, there is no water. Trees are key for our water, for our food, to feed our animals, for the whole nature itself. That's why this is a big concern for us. We see climate change having great effects on our territories as well. And so Vale do Javari is also feeling this climate change. And this is on top of the deforestation and logging, illegal logging that we see around. We need to see how we can defend our biodiversity, how we can protect our isolated peoples and all those indigenous peoples that are from Vale do Javari. You know, many peoples, indigenous peoples, have died in this endeavor. We lost many brothers and sisters. People from the Canamari community, for instance. This is a very difficult situation, and it is important that we support this struggle. You know, I've been at Koyabi for many years working on this. And we need also support from the government. The government is forgetting us, and something needs to happen soon before those threats continue scourging our territories. You know, some of these processes take time, including the demarcation process. And so these are testing times. And today we have technologies that are advancing that also suppose a challenge. Fortunately, Koyabi is an organization that is active, but it also needs to reach borders, those most difficult territories that have the largest challenges. We cannot overlook this reality. And I really want to take this voice and let you know what indigenous peoples are living in the border. Thank you so much. I see that there are many support voices in this webinar, as well as many questions. I'm sure we will be able to talk more about this throughout the webinar and even after. What you're saying is key. We need to really value this great service they're providing to the world. And this testing situation really requires a lot of support. Thank you for your words. So next up is Julio Kusurichiri. He is the director of the GATC program. He's a renowned indigenous leader. Has devoted decades of his life to territorial defense. Apo Julio, thank you for your leadership and presence. You have the floor. Thank you. So on behalf of IDESEB, greetings to all of you. IDESEB is one of the indigenous organizations of the Peruvian Amazon. Julio, are you muted perhaps? Let's try and give Julio a few minutes so that we can listen to him. In the meantime, let's pull up his presentation. I think we lost Julio. Let's see if he comes on again. Well, in the meantime, let's take some questions from the audience while we give some minutes to Julio. You can write down the question on the chat, and we will choose some of your comments. But let me ask you the first question to Leo.
comentaste la falta de
I
evidencia
remember you talked
que
about
en
the
el caso
lack
en
of
el territorio de
evidence
Yabarita Mirim fue rechazado diciendo que
that,
no
well,
había
in the
falta de
case of the
evidencia,
Jabari
que no es
territory,
real,
this was
se le puede
rejected,
hacer
stating
aislamiento.
that there was a lack of
Usted
evidence
mencionó que
of
realizó la
peoples in
muestra.
isolation.
¿Podría compartir un poco
But
qué
you said
significa
that
esa
you
práctica
saw
y cómo se
footprints.
manifiesta esa presencia en
Could
el
you
territorio?
elaborate more on
Me
this?
parece tan interesante.
And what can you make of this in terms of their presence in the territory? Leo speaking. Yes, we have been disseminating our activities for some time at the level of the organization and the Matses native community. We have demonstrated a lot of evidence, and the problem is that there's no political will by the state. The state doesn't give any importance or develop initiatives involving peoples in isolation. Look, we are the native Matses community, and we have several findings and also sightings, significant ones in this regard. We have conducted many activities in the defense of these territories and the peoples in
Muchas gracias,
isolation.
Leo. Y una preguntita, mientras tanto,
Florencia speaking.
para
Thank you, Leo.
ONEM,
A
mientras
question
se va
for
avanzando en
1M.
términos del mapeo y el reconocimiento
As we
del corredor,
progress on
pero hablaste
mapping
mucho de la
and
importancia
recognizing the
también de la
corridor, you also
demarcación
talked about the importance of
de las tierras y
demarcation
de otras
of
necesidades
the
de
land
tu comunidad.
and other needs
¿Quisieras
of
expandir un poquito
your
más
community. Could you elaborate more
cuáles son las barreras principales
on the main
respecto
barriers that you see
a recibir la ayuda que se requiere para
in
lograr
terms of
estos
receiving the
objetivos
aid
y
that is needed to achieve
cómo podemos
these
hacer
objectives?
para remover esas barreras?
What can we do to remove these barriers?
Juanem.
Oi, deu uma explicada, mas eu não consegui entender muito no final
I
ali da
was not able
pergunta.
to
Eu acho que eu
understand
entendi
the
de uma
last part of the
explicada. Você pode
question.
repetir novamente?
If you could
Con gusto, con
repeat
gusto.
the question,
Mi
please.
pregunta, y disculpa que no te la puedo decir en portugués, te entiendo, pero
Yeah, sorry, and I
todavía no puedo.
apologize. I cannot say it in
Era,
Portuguese.
estabas, perdón,
But the
remarcando la
question
necesidad de la
was
demarcación de
about the
las
fact
tierras
that
y
you
de
talked
todos los
about the
recursos que ustedes
demarcation of
requieren para
land
poder
and all the
avanzar
support
en
that
ese
you
liderazgo en ese
require to
trabajo
make
que están haciendo de
progress
la protección
on
de los
that
territorios.
leadership in terms
Y
of
hay
protecting the
barreras, ¿no?
territory.
Entonces quizás entender un poco más
And there are
cuáles son esas
barriers.
barreras
So
que
we would like to
encuentras en
understand
conseguir
those
ese apoyo tan
barriers that you
necesario.
see in order to find the needed support.
Bom, a questão do processo de demarcação de territórios, é
Yes, the
isso?
process
Então, assim,
in
existe
terms of territory
essa
demarcation,
demarcação, né, de processo que a gente trabalha
the
dentro da Coiab,
demarcation is a
exatamente
process
vem uma
that Koyab is
preocupação em
working
questão
on.
que a gente precisa, né, avançar
And there is a
na
concern
demarcação de
because we need
territórios, mas
to, of
também
course, make progress on
já tendo
territorial
a visão
demarcation,
que precisamos, né, fazer, né, a proteção desse
but we
território,
also need to
porque a gente
protect
se
that
sente, né,
territory.
então, que não está acontecendo, né? Então
But we
faz a
feel that
demarcação
is not
do
happening.
território, mas não está
So we
sendo
end up
protegido esses
demarking the
territórios.
territory,
Então
but
a
the
gente tem
territory is not
essa visão.
protected.
Eu tenho essa visão, mas eu
That
acredito que
is
precisa, né, fazer esse questionamento,
the
né,
issue.
para as autoridades
We need
competentes que
to
precisa, não é só
challenge
fazer a demarcação do
relevant
território
authorities.
e não
It's
ir
not only
mais
about
dar atenção
demarcating the
para os povos
territory,
indígenas que estão dentro do território, mas o Estado, o
and
governo, e a gente
but
precisa estar
rather that
presente,
we
não é
need
que está
from the
sendo,
state,
né,
from
após a
governments,
demarcação de territórios. Então, para não
how
acontecer
protection
essa
will take
questão de
place after
muita
the
invasão que
demarcation
está
of
acontecendo aqui no
territories,
território,
so that
eu
we
acredito
are
é
able to
falta mesmo
prevent the invasion that is happening in the territory.
de cuidado mesmo, de estar lá junto com os parentes, porque tem muitos
Which is
profissionais
happening because of lack of
capacitados para estar
care.
atuando nesses
Look, we have
locais.
many
Então,
trained
essa presência
professional brothers and
do
sisters
Estado, mesmo na
that are
comunidade, então
acting
eles percebem
on the
que
ground,
está tendo atenção, mas se deixar somente os povos
and
indígenas
they know
após a demarcação, o
that they
que vai
can do
acontecer
so
que às
much
vezes
if
eles
they do
carregam
not
aqueles
receive
indígenas
support
mesmo
from the
com
government
mesmas
and the state.
dificuldades de fazer proteger os territórios. Então
It
vai
is
ser mais
important that
fácil
these
de ser
territories be
convencido,
protected.
ser trocas, né, de pequenas mercadorias por retiradas de madeiras ilegais.
And
Aí
this
já começa
requires, for example,
os
removing
desafios quando o governo,
the
o Estado ou
marketing
mesmo o
of
Brasil,
illegal
quando for
logging, for instance.
precisa saber o que está acontecendo, os desafios, os problemas dentro do território já é bem
This
maior.
is
Então, eu
important
acho que
because many times what ends up
essa,
happening is that
essa
when governments
preocupação
come
mesmo
in,
com povos indígenas
the
está vendo,
problem
mesmo
is
que
bigger than
tenha a
before.
terra homologada, mas precisa, né, de dar atenção,
So,
sempre estar
yes, indigenous
presente,
peoples
porque
may
eu sinto
have
muita falta
their
dessa
lands
presência
validated, but of course,
do
care
governo, do
is important,
Estado, mesmo
protection
da
is
COIAB,
required.
mesmo que eu estou dentro da COIAB, mas assim, eu sei que a
We
COIAB
need the presence
tem,
of the
né, uma
government,
equipe muito grande,
of the
né,
state.
trabalhando de cada estado,
Kuyabi
mas
is trying to
precisa ser uma
work
pessoa
in
que é
different
contratado
with different
que
states with
realmente
big
que tem
teams,
compromisso
but
de
we
trabalho para
need
estar
larger
atuando
commitment
nessas
on
regiões,
this.
territórios. Então eu sinto falta disso,
We need
né?
greater
Então eu estou
support
buscando
in
para que
our
isso
territories.
melhore cada vez mais. Não quer dizer que não está pior, mas
Now,
precisa chegar
I'm not
esse
saying
nível,
that
né? Que essa
there has
população
been
que
some
se sintam
progress, but we
protegidos e
need
acolhidos e
to reach a
preparados,
high
né?
level
Para estar
so
fazendo
that
monitoramento de
that
seus próprios
population
territórios,
can
que é
feel
a casa
protected
deles, é a casa
and
nossa,
welcomed.
aonde que a gente precisa,
We,
né,
we are
proteger
monitoring
cada
their
vez mais para
territories and
não
we need to
acontecer tanta
protect them
invasão,
even more so
né,
so that
dentro
we
dos
can
territórios. Isso
prevent
vem a preocupação, também a
invasion
preocupação dos
inside these
povos indígenas
territories.
isolados e de recentes contatos que eles precisam ser protegidos
This is
e
also a
não
concern
serem
of isolated
ameaçados.
indigenous peoples.
Obrigada. Muito
They
obrigada,
need
Goya.
to feel
Muy importante.
protected and not feel threatened.
Em, Vamos a pasar ahora a Julio, que por suerte lo hemos podido tener conectado
Thank
nuevamente.
you.
Julio, no sé si nos puedes
So
escuchar
Julio
y
is on
podemos
again.
ahora tener tus perspectivas.
Julio, can you hear us? If you could please share your perspectives.
Julio, ¿nos escuchas?
Julio, can you hear us?
Vamos a darle un minuto a Julio.
Let's just give Julio a minute.
No, no está funcionando. Ahora
No, it's not working.
Acá lo tenemos a Julio.
So it seems like we have him here. Julio, you have the floor. Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Apologies because I weren't able to join properly because there's some issues with technology. But I just do want to say that as IDESIP, we have been working on Indigenous peoples in isolation issues for a while. And these Indigenous peoples, because of the rubber trade a long time ago, decided to live inside the forest in order to protect their lives. So in Peru, there are isolated peoples, and through the indigenous government, 25 of them have been recognized. And through IDESEP and indigenous organizations like Orubu, Contiac, Orpio, Conamac, we have been requesting the creation of territorial reserves. However, it has taken a very long time, 10, 20 years. And in that time, the issue of territorial invasion by loggers, miners, even illegal activities has caused problems for these peoples. So the Peruvian state, through the Congress, has several times suggested to modify the law on Indigenous peoples in isolation, making certain rules more flexible and giving regional governments the power to establish territorial reserves. And in practice, this has enabled progress because many local governments are facing this issue of illegal logging and mining and don't take into account the rights of these peoples. So IDESEP and the other organizations with support from allies and coalitions have created territorial reserves and even created vigilance and control areas together with other support from other institutions and territorial organizations. Nevertheless, this has caused problems because it leads to the assassination of leaders, the threatening of leaders because we are defending their lives and territories. So this is what is happening in Peru. And narratives are created that say that defending this territory is an obstacle to the progress of these communities, and there's an implication that there won't be health services, education services, access to surrounding environments and communities, and that's absolutely false. The creation of territorial reserves for Indigenous peoples in isolation does not mean that there will not be support for surrounding communities. There are even mayors who have reported and have annulled the validity of some of the reserves in Peru. That's important to know because while Indigenous organizations are contributing, creating systems and support for monitoring and evaluation, our formal authorities are creating laws and rules that go against the interests and rights of Indigenous peoples. And when we report, whether it be loggers or other organizations, the report moves fast. But when we report this kind of rights violations, the case is filed or ignored. So this is a bit of an overview of what is happening in Peru. We have a great concern about the non-implementation of Convention 169 of the ILO to protect these rights. there's a great delay. And while that delay takes place, we have concerns about our brothers and sisters' lives who live in isolation. Thank you very much, Julio, for all of your work and leadership. First, thank you also for your flexibility and ability to solve problem solves and join on your phone. Thank you for your very important words. To follow up, just like I did with Leon Guaneb, your perspective on all of these issues that you're telling us about, what would be, we have an audience here listening to you with many different kinds of relevant actors, including donors, including people who are committed to the space. So what is the message? What do you need in order to overcome these barriers? The important thing would be to strengthen the organizational capacities of Indigenous organizations on the ground and from a national perspective, like IDESEP, because if we don't strengthen these, regardless of how many narratives there are at the in national and international level, the economic activity that is working, whether it be illegal logging or fossil fuels, those actors will try to break down our organization in order to have voices saying that they are against the work with Indigenous peoples in isolation. So that's why it's so important to strengthen our organizations, because we are the ones as Indigenous organizations who voice our opinions. Of course, our allies support us with resources, but our allies never directly face the government, even though they do contribute with resources. And another thing, it's also important for human rights organizations like the Inter-American Court of Justice should pronounce themselves about certain reports brought forward by organizations like IDESEP about the defense of life of these Indigenous peoples through a cautionary measure and a petition that has been presented at the Inter-American Commission and at the Inter-American Court also, two different institutions, so two different cases. And so this is a call upon our governments to comply with the regulations. And I think that no economic activity in any country should violate the rights of our Indigenous peoples in isolation, because they are hugely important and vulnerable. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julio, for your words, which were extremely clear, in my opinion, about the needs and the financial and legal support required and the requirement for compliance of PSC and all the Indigenous peoples in the surrounding environments who carry out a fundamental work to protect our brothers and sisters in isolation. It has been a pleasure to hear all of your voices of our speakers. Unfortunately, we have very little time, because it would be very interesting to continue listening and discussing, but we have to move forward. So we're going to expand our perspective with the second part and go beyond the Yavarita Piche corridor, which is not an isolated case. So now we're going to speak about what's happening in other regions of the world. First, we're going to talk about the Amazon region in a more vast way, in a more general way, and then we'll speak about other territories of the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. So that said, thank you to the panelists of the first panel. And now we are going to invite our next two panelists to the floor. First of all, we have Fanny Cuiru Castro, Coordinator General of COICA. Fanny, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for your leadership. You have the floor. Please do share with us your thoughts. Thank you. Thank you very much, Flore. And hello, welcome to everybody, my brothers, Julio, and all my other brothers and Indigenous brothers and sisters who are present here. I want to welcome the branches of COICA who are present here, also our colleagues from Confenaye, my brother there from Ecuador. We have listened to our brothers from the territories, from the regions, telling us what their main challenge is every day, considering what is happening in the Amazon region with the mega projects that are being carried out in the region. I think that Earth Insight's report, which was presented at COP30, is the tip of the iceberg of everything that is happening in indigenous territories located in tropical forest regions. COICA represents 511 indigenous peoples from the Amazon basin in 9 countries. And we have the international representation of everything that happens in the Amazon region. That's why it's always important to be connected to our grassroots organizations, because they are at the front line facing all the problems and issues that happen in the Amazon region. Be it legal issues about land concessions, projects being carried out by states, or illegal activities that take place in our large Amazon region. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's happening in this region. Extractivism has always been present in the Amazon. And in the name of a misunderstood development, forests have been destroyed, sacrifices have been made, and rights violations have been committed against Indigenous peoples. At the beginning of last century, the exploitation of rubber caused an immense genocide in Bolivia, Peru, Brazil, and Colombia, and the Amazon region. And this is a topic that has been buried, that nobody speaks about. But extractivism exposed the territory, biodiversity, the forest, and the peoples who live there, the people who take care of this land, my people. We always talk about development in the Amazon region. Territories are handed over to exploitation for oil and mining, for legal exploitation, because the state is also one of the actors that hands out concessions to companies who then extract resources like oil, minerals, wood, a series of resources that are taken from the region, leaving the population in poverty and the lands degraded. Today, extractivism for a green transition is also in vogue, but in reality, it's just another modality to exploit the territory. So today we're talking about minerals like copper, nickel, essential minerals for development, which are located in the Amazon region, will be exploited. 1 second, sorry, I'm busy. Excuse me. So these essential minerals are said to serve to create clean energy and to mitigate the effects of climate change. But this is not altogether true. All of this extractivism that takes place in the Amazon region through oil projects, mining projects, are always encouraged and financed by foreign companies. Particularly today, China is present in the Amazon region. They come to Indigenous peoples' lands to exploit without respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, like free, prior, informed consent and consultations. These rights are not being respected, and that's why our organizations are there. That's why we have these branches in each country, and that is also why COICA is working to make sure that the rights of Indigenous peoples are respected on the front lines. The Amazon region is full of oil companies, mining companies, and it is the most recent activities in Brazil are hugely concerning. For the government to allow the exploitation of the Amazon riverbeds oil reserves, which will endanger the river and the surrounding environment. Now, to speak about illegal mining, the presence of mining activities are so grave because it's what most contaminates and pollutes the region. More than 300 rivers are polluted and more than 6,000 tons of mercury end up in these rivers. And who are the most affected by this? Indigenous peoples. And how so? As Earth Insight's report confirms, the population's health is directly affected. I am now in Ecuador, and every day we witness the implications for indigenous populations. What Texaco did in the past and other oil companies did, how these activities still today affect the lives and health of this population. People dying, there are people fighting for recognition, for justice, but nobody listens. Everybody seems to be deaf when it comes to this kind of situation. There's also organized crime throughout the Amazon region. Drug trafficking does not only affect biodiversity and forest and rivers, it also affects life and the social order of communities. So it's a presence of actors who work outside the law, which are seriously affecting the Amazon region. The other issue is the voluntary carbon market. There are companies today which are companies that have signed agreements with Indigenous peoples organizations, and they now have a concession of Indigenous peoples' lands for 20, 30 years. And in Bolivia, there's a concession for up to 1,000 years. And what it is abuse, because there is no state presence in those corners of the Amazon region. And that is where Indigenous organizations carry out this work. And what does this mean? For example, our Amazon region has reached its point of no return. COICA has just presented a report we did at COP30 about the health of the Amazon. More than 30% of the forest has been deforested or degraded. It used to be 27%. It was said that if it reached 27%, that was the point of no return. And we have gone past that. Our mapping has clearly shown this 30% degradation and deforestation. The crisis of Indigenous peoples, how their health is being affected by mercury, by oil, the displacement of communities, the rupture of traditional livelihoods, the violation of human rights of these peoples, the criminalization and assassination of defenders, tied to the economic dependence that is caused by drug trafficking, organized crime, mining and logging, because they recruit our youth. And our Indigenous youth don't have many other options except to go to these actors. So there's a series of things that are happening in the Amazon region, and that is where we, as Julie was saying, that is where we need to reinforce our self-government systems in each of our countries, starting from the communities to the local level to the national level. We need to strengthen in parallel organizations like COICA as well. Every organization requires comprehensive reinforcement, not only of one part. It's that to reinforce these governance systems to continue taking care of the Amazon and promote indigenous economies.
So COICA is promoting the indigenous economy as an alternative. Some may oppose to it, but it is rather a way to prevent our youth from joining illegal groups We need to also support global initiatives in place. COICA, Florencia, and her organization also presented a motion to the UICN. This was the motion 068 to comprehensively restore the Amazon to 80% by 2030. So we are doing the advocacy, but the states and the allies need to join forces around this work so that we can continue defending and protecting and reverting the damage that has been done on the Amazon. We can talk for hours about this, but there are solutions in the Amazon. There are organized indigenous peoples, governance systems. There's recognition in Colombia of territorial entities. And this requires, of course, demarcation and titling of great percentage of the territory. In the end, they are the ones taking care of the territories down by biodiversity. So we need to recognize the indigenous peoples in how they protect and take care of vital ecosystems, including the Amazon, which is vital for our planet. Thank you, Fanny, showing some of the threats and solutions. Now it is a pleasure to introduce to you Juan Carlos Sanchez Arcos. He's an Executive Secretary of Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. You have the floor, Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos speaking. It is a pleasure to greet you all, to have listened to our brothers and sisters that came before me, including I, the SEP, and the coordinator of the Amazon Basin. So I want to talk about three main moments. But before I go into that, let me give you some context around the efforts of territorial leadership. We have seen many cases of leadership and the fact that institution engagement needs to be strengthened. So, the Amazon Basin, the Congo Basin, the big territorial basins of this global territory where you find living peoples, peoples who have proposals, need to be protected. And Global Alliance, the platform I'm part of, is trying to push this. It is important to raise visibility among the different leaderships, the Amazon Basin, Mesoamerica, the Caribbean, PB, Brazil, all ecosystems. It is important that we raise visibility to the threats that exist against indigenous communities living in these places. Look, Global Alliance raises awareness and connects more than 1 million hectares. In this context, the region of the Congo Basin are addressed. We see that there are many oil concessions that overlap with millions of hectares, including 6.9 million hectares of community forests and 38% of community forests. So we're talking about around 42% of community forests that are overlapping with oil and gas blocks. This is an emerging concern, of course, and that requires us to strengthen institutionality and self-governance. It also requires to give follow-up and credibility of our leaderships in our own institutions. Now, another member of the Global Alliance of the Territorial Rainforests is Amman. Look, 18% of indigenous territories are overlapping with logging concessions. 6 million hectares of indigenous territories are overlapping with logging concessions as well, and 1.6 million of hectares of territories are overlapping with oil and gas blocks, and 0.9 million hectares of indigenous territories are overlapping with mining concessions. So, regional organizations such as that from Indonesia, Amman, and other organizations really welcomed this report because it really gives some input on how to resolve and work on this emerging issue. Another member of the Global Alliance is located in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean, MPB. So in this context, 107 million hectares of indigenous peoples and local communities and they are overlapping with 3.7 million hectares of oil and gas blocks and 18 million hectares of mining concessions are overlapping with also indigenous peoples and local communities' lands. We're talking about 17% of land from indigenous peoples and local communities. We carried out a significant endeavor at the early this year, and Koika mentioned its government plans, its plan in the emerging proposal with other global organizations to tackle extractive threats in territories from indigenous peoples and local communities. This is something that is increasingly present, and so that's why we want or we're working on a strategic approach with our territorial organizations of Global Alliance to strengthen these results. So, we are not putting this at the background, but rather we're trying to reinforce and provide an opportunity to verify tested models. We have, for instance, the law for Pigneo peoples at the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was approved in 2022, and it provides legal recognition to the rights of Pigneos indigenous peoples to land. Also, in Cameroon, we see that conservation models are being put in place. This includes 60 participatory plans on land use and maps. These are some of the examples that are important to make visible. These are brothers that are supporting our credibility, trust, and institutionality. These are examples of regional leaderships who are facing collective pressure and calling for solidarity and coordination. In Guatemala, due to forest concessions, the communities lost 1.5 million hectares of their forests. But on the other side, in Indonesia, around 191 hectares of territories were recovered through the mapping and the use of participatory instruments, as well as local reforms. And the government of Indonesia is going to transfer or give back indigenous territories to local communities, and this would be at around 1,400,000 hectares. So it is important that we work together. We need to join forces, all our territorial organizations, in order to continue making progress on this. That's why these spaces are so important. Look, Global Alliance welcomes, talks about, and presents the different positions in the global agenda to protect our territories. Last year, we issued the Declaration of Brazzaville. It included visibility of the work done in different basins, such as the Amazon Basin and the Congo Basin. But there are more basins that need to be made visible. And this requires more voices so that we can really become that legitimate actor that brings together all these territorial voices. We had the first global conference for transition beyond fossil fuels, and this initiative requires direct support from our regional and territorial organizations. That is the key. The Global Alliance working together under a strategic and unity framework with different dialogue platforms so that we can take the representation of territorial actors, guardians, and forest owners to global platforms so that all these data, all these threats can be really be seen and understood. There are different opportunities. The Brazzaville statement, the meeting in Santa Marta, so that we can continue supporting our leaders and showing real solutions. We should put an end to extractivism, to the degradation of nature. We need to uphold the rights of nature. It is a living being. We need to really also work on direct funding. It has to reach the territories. It has to follow the own mechanisms of organizations. That has to change. And this type of instruments and studies that are showcased is the real ref reflection of what is happening. It is not something we're making up. It is something that is really happening and that requires solidarity and support from indigenous institutions, communities, and organizations. This also encompasses other topics such as claims, prior consultation, criminalization. We need to stop all this. We need to stop the destruction, the concessions in indigenous territories, and also for our ancestral knowledge and wisdom to be taken into account, to be part of those agendas. for future generations. This is the way we can continue generating pushback on all these threats. Thank you. Florencio speaking. Thank you, Juanca. Your words were very clear, and we really want to thank the support of all these leaders. We want to thank all the attendees, all the panelists, all of our allies, Tinta, IDESEP, COICA, Orpio, the Global Alliance, and let this be a call for continue to support this endeavor. I also want to thank the team of colleagues who really interviewed, who really made all the work